Hello, welcome. Today we are going to talk about environments in Daggerheart. I'm Mike. I was one of the designers of the game. My credit is additional designer. I worked on a lot of aspects in Daggerheart, but one of the aspects that I put a lot of time in, I wouldn't say the most, but I put a lot of time into environments and had I think a pretty big hand in shaping how they were developed and, writing a fair number of them that have ended up in the core book. So I'm really excited to talk more about environments and to give you my perspective on how we put them together, why they work the way that they do, how you can use them. Thank you so much, G2 Buddy, and thank you for the follow. I didn't have that part of the feed up yesterday, but I appreciate it. Thanks for coming back. So, environments. These are built to be a complement to and to really seamlessly interact with and overlap with adversaries in Daggerheart, right? So Daggerheart draws on the narrative game tradition, especially Powered by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark type games, but not exclusively. And in games where we have this idea of the GM move, right? The GM move can take any number of forms. In Daggerheart, we have specific kind of like subsystems or structures for adversaries and for environments. And adversaries existed much earlier in the design process. And environments we added to give a bit more, I think of it as adding more structure for the kinds of moves that you could do as a GM anyway, right? When I'm running a Forge in the Dark game or a Powered by the Apocalypse game, I make environmental moves pretty often. There are other structures that are kind of adjacent to environments in different fantasy adventure games, right? In D&D 4th edition, there were trap stat blocks. In Pathfinder 2nd edition, I believe they are called hazards, right? And it's a little bit different, right, in each of these different games. In Dungeon World, we have the idea of dungeon fronts. In various games, especially in OSR, you might have the dungeon turn, which represents kind of the environment continuing to evolve. So I'm not claiming that this is like 100% new tech, but I do think the way that we do it specifically in Daggerheart is cool and I like it. And right, it is that way because I had an input in making it that way, and it being done and published, I'm still excited about it and proud of it. And so I'm going to talk about it for you all to enjoy. Now I'm going to tab over to this version where we have the SRD up. So this is page 100 of the Daggerheart SRD as of May 20th this week. The SRD is the document that we can homebrew from, right? If you're making third-party material, you're trying to publish new stuff for Daggerheart, the SRD is where we're going to go to look at things. So here, there is a very brief write-up on using environments, which says, environments represent everything in a scene beyond the PCs and the adversaries, such as the physical space, background NPCs, and natural forces. In the core book, there's, a bit more about environments, but the first thing I wanted to do as we get underway here is to just give a quick rundown of the parts of an environment so that we're all on the same page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump down to one of these examples and I'm going to talk from it because I think it's a little bit easier to have the full thing there, and I will provide the guidance, right? So this is the name of the thing, right? The name is Abandoned Grove. Environments, like adversaries, have tiers. They go from tier 1 to tier 4. Tier 1 is for level 1 characters, starting characters. Environments, like adversaries, have types. So the types of environments are exploration, event, social, and traversal. Exploration environments, 5e has layer actions, absolutely. So when developing environments, there were a number of different approaches and perspectives on how does the space or the thing around the characters that aren't adversaries work. And then thinking about all of that, we adapted that into the structure that matched the structure with adversaries so that they could be easier, that it would be more seamless to use them alongside one another, right? In a given scene, you might have some adversaries and an environment. And then when you're GMing and you get the chance to take a GM move, right, you have a little bit of a menu of options to choose from. In a game that doesn't have a little bit more structure for environments, but it does have structure for adversaries, right? You might have structure here and you have examples, but then you would have to fully improvise anything else. And so you might just naturally gravitate toward what you have the structure for. And I think it's totally understandable, especially if there isn't a really obvious immediate response given a certain trigger for a GM move. Building structure for environments, we make it easier to not just kind of always focus in on and spotlight adversaries, but we can also think more holistically about the scene. So an exploration type environment is one where the main role that it plays in the scene is the player characters engaging with that environment to gain information, uncover things, and or deal with the implications of being in a place that is dangerous or where there's uncertainty. The other types are event. An event environment is just a thing that is happening or that can happen that's less about, or an event environment can be happening or not happening in the same space as other environments, right? You could have an ambush in an abandoned grove, but an ambush can happen other places, and you can be in an abandoned grove and not have there be an ambush happening. So you could theoretically add an event environment to an other environment and be doing other stuff with the scene. That might get a little tricky, or maybe you think about rolling some of those event elements into a other environment and have a bit more of that eventness baked in. Abandoned Grove has some options along those lines, right? Let me not get ahead of myself. We have environment types. There is a short description of the environment, a former druidic grove, lying fallow and fully reclaimed by nature. Then environments have impulses, which represent kind of the thing that they try to make happen in the scene, or the things that they incentivize in action, whether that is action from the player characters or action from NPCs. So an abandoned grove draws in the curious and it echoes the past. Environments, like adversaries, have a difficulty number, right? That's the number that you have to meet or beat when you're making an action against an environment, or when that environment is forcing you to make a reaction roll, you would use that difficulty for the overall environment. Environments have potential adversaries. This is kind of a prep tool and a little bit of a type of signposting, right? Hey, in an abandoned grove, you might have beasts. You might have these kind of woodland faction adversaries like a treant, a sylvan soldier, or a young dryad. If you are preparing a scene where you know that something is going to happen in an abandoned grove, or that the player characters are absolutely going to an abandoned grove, you might pull up the abandoned grove stat block, and then you might also pull up some beasts and or grove guardians so that you have everything in front of you for what you expect to happen. You can have a scene in an environment without any of these adversaries. Some environments make more sense to have without adversaries, and some make more sense to have with adversaries. There's a couple of environments in Tier 3 that are a castle siege and a pitched battle, right? Like an open battle. In those, you're probably going to have adversaries because the player characters are either going to be on one side of this conflict, or they are going to be interlopers. And so people on one or both sides are going to kind of challenge them if the player characters are moving through that space. The next big things that environments have are features. And then within features, there are these feature questions or prompts. So if we look at Abandoned Grove. We have the Overgrown Battlefield, and it is of the passive type of feature. As with adversaries, features can be passive. They're kind of always on. They can be actions. They are GM moves that you can take as a way to spotlight and utilize an environment or an adversary if it's an adversary action. And then there are reactions, which are features and moves that you can take outside of normal order of play when that specific trigger occurs. In Daggerheart, the GM section says you can make a move whenever a player character rolls with fear on an action roll, whenever they fail an action roll. And then there's a couple of other triggers. One is when they give you a golden opportunity, and that's the one I tend to think about, along with when an action has immediate repercussions or when the characters take an action that has immediate repercussions. Both of those are the mechanical indicator for reaction type moves, right? The player characters are doing something and the other parts of the rules don't automatically give you a move, right? They didn't get the particular results on an action roll, but it makes sense as a storytelling game that something would happen. And so reactions are a way of giving that a mechanical manifestation to make it easier to think about having the fiction, having the story world push back on the player characters in certain exceptional situations, rather than fully committing yourself and being bound to the action back and forth. That is, the GM will only act when the players roll with fear, or the players fail, or when the GM spends fear. Some reactions might cost a fear. Otherwise, right, the GM can spend fear to take a turn as if the players had rolled a failure or with fear, right? It doesn't generate another fear, but it lets the GM say, hey, normally the players would maintain the spotlight, but I'm going to spend a fear and I'm going to take the spotlight to make a move. With a reaction, you can make a move without having to do that expenditure of fear, but each reaction has a really specific trigger of when you can use it. Overgrown Battlefield is a passive. With a lot of exploration environments, there's just a bit of text that's like, hey, well, here's what's going on, right? There has been a battle here. A PC can make an instinct roll to identify evidence of that fight. On a success with hope, learn all 3 pieces of information below. On a success with fear, learn 2. On a failure, a PC can mark a stress to learn 1 and gain advantage on the next action roll to investigate this environment. This is a PBTA move to me, right? This is when you investigate an abandoned grove, roll plus instinct, right? That's PBTA language. Here we have instinct roll. And the best you can get is a roll with hope, so you get all 3 pieces of information. A success with fear is like a 7 to 9, a mixed result. You gain some of the information. And on a failure, you can gain information and gain advantage in further investigations so that a failure is not a null result, right? Whenever possible in Daggerheart, we try to avoid, I failed and nothing happens, right? When a player rolls a failure or when they roll with fear, the thing that happens is the GM's move. For this feature, we want the action to stay focused on the player characters and their investigation. And so we're giving a little bit of a structure for, hey, you can get something so that you don't feel like you've kind of been stonewalled, but then the GM would still get a move, right? Because the result is part of the passive, not a separate reaction or a separate action feature. It also notes that a PC with an appropriate background or experience can learn an additional detail and ask a follow-up question about the scene to get a truthful, if not always complete answer, right? So there's an extra little bit that reminds you to keep the fiction in mind. And if you have a wild-born character who's investigating an abandoned grove, you might just give them additional information for free because it makes sense based on who they are and what they have experienced in life. Or if you have a character that isn't wild-born, but they have an experience that says, forensic analysis, right? Maybe they're a rogue who's kind of a detective. Then you might give them some information here. Those 3 bits of information are traces of a battle, like broken weapons and branches, gouges in the ground that are all littering the ground. Number 2, a moss-covered tree trunk is actually the corpse of a treant. And 3, still standing trees are twisted in strange ways, as if by powerful magic. So this is a feature that gives the GM the material to deal with the player characters investigating the space, right? You give a description as they come into the abandoned grove, and they are likely to want to poke around and see what's happening. This feature is the thing that you can have so that when they say, hey, I want to do this, or hey, I'm going to walk around and I'm going to get down on all fours and I'm going to look at everything really closely. And you go, great, that I'm going to use the overgrown battlefield passive. Here is what I'm going to ask you to do. Make that instinct roll. And then I, as the GM, know how I can, but not necessarily this is an option. You don't have to do only exactly what the feature says, right? You can improvise adversary features. You can improvise environment features. But here is a complete option. You can just use this feature as it is written. Then, the last thing that this feature has is a feature question or some feature questions. These are questions for the GM to ask themselves and think about, and or to ask the player characters, right? Why did these groups come to blows? Why is the grove unused now? You can reflect on these feature questions during prep and take some notes that will help you round out the scene or maybe create additional hooks. Or sometimes you can take those questions and then pose them to the player characters or the players, right? So with barbed vines, one of the questions is, how many vines are there? Where do they grab you? Do they pull you down or lift you off the ground? Those are more for the player characters or for the players to decide for their characters if you want to give them that freedom, or for the GM to keep in mind when they're giving those descriptions. G2 Buddy says, I love the freedom that Daggerheart makes available. Thank you. That's absolutely kind of the agenda that we were going for, right? To have that freedom and flexibility of a narrative kind of game that we then combine with some more structure like we have with environments and in a bit of a crunchier combat system than you might get in other like narrative games. So that's the quick overview of environments. Here's what an environment could look like. This next bit is absolutely just my personal take and the way that I think about and run Daggerheart. To me, there is always an environment in every given scene. I don't mean that I'm always using a specific stat block. I'm just always keeping the fact that I can use the structure and the framework of environments in any given scene. In other RPGs, in other story games, right, you can make a move that makes sense within the fiction. And a lot of the time, those moves that you make would be represented or could be represented in Daggerheart as environment features or environment actions. By thinking about any given scene as there's always an environment present, that may also help me figure out what the difficulty of a role for when a player character is interacting with a place should be. Because if I've thought, okay, this environment is going to default to like a difficulty 12, and then someone asks about doing something that would take an action roll, I already have that number of 12 off the top of my head. Now, maybe I can improvise it and that's not necessarily a problem. Or maybe when I'm doing prep, I don't want to write up a whole environment stat block like we have over here, but I do want to just note down a difficulty, and then maybe I write down just 1, 2, 3 bullet points of types of moves or types of features that this environment might have. And instead of writing them out in full mechanical language, I just have them as notes and reminders to myself, and then I improvise the move in the moment. This is not too hard for me because I have a lot of experience with the narrative style of GMing, and this specifically is not hard for me because I am one of the game's designers. Hopefully, between this stream and the SRD and a lot of other material and knowledge that the community is going to build together, right? That's Darrington Press and creators within the community and players and GMs, that together we will develop the fluency that will make it easier for any given GM to be able to improvise environment moves or environment features throughout their game and feel comfortable doing so, right? That's a goal of mine, and part of why I'm doing streams like this, to try to help provide additional resources using a different structure, right? What I'm doing here is very conversational. It is not as buttoned up and distilled as Get Your Sheet Together, but sometimes people really benefit from hearing somebody talk through all of the elements of something, right? Giving a lot more context, having more examples, and things like that. So that's why we're here. That is a quick overview of environments. My next beat, right? I have 3 big things here. What are environments? How do you use them as a GM? And making your own environments. So how do you use them as a GM? We've already talked a little bit about. There's a couple more things that I want to introduce as some ways that you can do this and some ways that you can think about how to use environments in Daggerheart. One of the ways that I think about environments is like a scene in a box, right? It's almost like a modular adventure, a unit of adventure, a unit of gameplay. I remember just enough from my high school chemistry class to remember the idea between atoms and moles, right? That you have a mole of something, not like on my face, but like a group of atoms in this that is bigger than an individual atom of a particular element or something. Environments are kind of like molar narrative, right? There's a chunk of things together that's bigger than any one individual element. An abandoned grove is trees and the trace of a battlefield and the potential for people to show up and say, hey, what are you doing here, right? It's a number of things together. And if you have an environment ready or in mind for your scene, you have a number of different kind of buttons to press or levers to pull. Another way of thinking about environments is as concretized preparation. When I'm preparing Daggerheart sessions, I will often just make a new environment, and so secret insider info, a number of the environments in Daggerheart I created as preparation for playtest games I was running, and then I revised them and they went into the manuscript. You can do this too. You can create a new environment. It can be really incomplete. It can be just what you need it to be for that scene or that session. And then if you use it, that's great. If you don't use it, maybe you can come back to it later. And if you use it and then you want to share it or kind of refine it and publish it, right, you can just take the work you've already done, you can build on it, and you can use the community gaming license, right? That's great. For me, the process of building an environment is a way of orienting my mind to create the preparation I need to run a scene. And so, because all these processes align for me, environments help make my Daggerheart prep easier. And I'm hoping that with the right explanation and the right examples, a lot of which have already been put into the game, right, because they are in the environments themselves, in the same way that a lot of structure and hopefully inspiration was put into the adversaries. If you read the section on environments in the game, or in the SRD, but mostly in the game because there's more there. If you look at the structure and then you read the environments and think about where the open seams are, right? How could you add to this environment? How could you change an environment to be a slight variation, right? How does an abandoned grove become a haunted grove? How does an abandoned grove become a corrupted grove? If you look at Abandoned Grove and Burning Heart of the Woods side by side, you could go, okay, so an abandoned grove could turn into a Burning Heart of the Woods, but what happens in the middle? Or you could look at the Burning Heart of the Woods and go, well, what happens if the player characters or if somebody has kind of addressed the main problem, but you still have this part of a forest that got really screwed up and isn't back to being like healthy, aligned with nature forest. So you can use environments and build on them. You can modify them. And I'm hoping that GMs and creators and designers will read through environments and see the elements of design that we have put into environments, and then think about how they can transport, replicate, or modify those elements for their own Daggerheart games, Daggerheart material, and other game design. One of the things that I really love about Powered by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark design is that, at least for me, when I read especially really well-written material in those traditions, I can feel like it is open to me. I can understand how stuff fits together, and it's less intimidating, if not really inviting, for me to think about, okay, here's what's written, and here's how I can get in there and mess with it, right? I can make it my own. The idea of creating custom moves in Powered by the Apocalypse, right, comes directly and very specifically from Apocalypse World. Apocalypse World was written, to the best of my understanding from what I hear from Vincent and Maggie Baker, to have that sense of openness. And then I know separately from John Harper that Blades in the Dark was written with some of that same transparency to then be encouragement for people to make it their own, right? And so coming from or working in this design tradition of openness and having there be this precedent from other games with their own SRDs or using Creative Commons licenses or whatever, and given the fact that Daggerheart is meant to be a collaborative game, all of those help push us, I think, toward trying to design in a way that feels open, and you feel like you can crack the box open and move things around to make it do what you need it to do without feeling like everything is really opaque and that you don't understand the interior workings of something. So, other stuff in terms of how you use an environment, right? An environment can be an accent or an enhancement of a scene that you already had planned. It's like, okay, this is going to be a fight, but one of the ways you can make an action or a combat scene really powerful, really dynamic, really emotionally impactful is by thinking more broadly, more holistically, and considering the environment around them, right? Okay, there's a bandit camp. So there's going to be a bunch of bandits. What about the way the bandits have made camp is notable that you can maybe describe, or that could make an impact on how that scene might play out, right? Are their buildings all backed up against hills so you can't sneak in the back? Oh, well, actually you can sneak in the back because they have tunnels. Okay, what would it take to identify one of those tunnels if the player characters came up on the bandit camp from the backside? When would I want to ask for a roll? If you're attacking a bandit camp and you've been telegraphing that a storm was coming, okay, well, what does fighting or moving through a bandit camp during a rainstorm feel like? How does that fiction impact the action rolls and the mechanics of that scene, right? It is storming. We can think about as an event environment, right? Okay, well, what would the event environment it is like, or the event environment thunderstorm? Okay, what does that do, right? Maybe it has some feature about making your footing more unsure. You know, you take disadvantage on rolls where the surety of footing is important due to the slickness caused by the thunderstorm, right? Do you have something about heavy winds? Do you have something about the potential of something getting struck by lightning, right? Maybe struck by lightning or lightning strike is a fear move. And you go, so that's lightning strike, action, spend 2 fear, something, something, something. We're going to do making our own environment here in a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down thunderstorm as an event type environment, and then maybe we can come back. The fun thing about this is doing this stream makes me do homebrew that I can then do other things with, right? I can fold it into my games, or I can make it here and then put it aside for some potential future community gaming license release. This is the revelation of my master plan. Doing streams where I do homebrew means that I get homebrew done and that I can then do other things with. So the last thing on how do you use environments or what are environments about would be just underscoring again the idea that improvising environments for me is just a GM move that spotlights the world or an event happening, right? The world is the environment, an event happening is the environment. And so an environment stat block is just a concretization of that in the way that I could, if I was really up against a wall and I needed to improvise an adversary, I could start with how do I describe them in my head and a difficulty number. And then I wouldn't need anything else until something happened that would require a more concrete bit of material, right? I introduce a ghost dragon. I'm like, okay, ghost dragon. I'm going to think about how to describe a ghost dragon, and then I'm going to give it a base difficulty of 16. And then as the fiction evolves, I might need to decide or create other mechanical elements of this being that exists in the fiction, right? If I introduce it and a character says, oh crap, I'm going to just pull my bow and shoot one of my magic arrows at it. Okay, well, I know what the difficulty is. If they hit, then I have to think about damage thresholds, hit points, stress. If I want to go to that extent in working the scene, if I'm playing like a really loosey-goosey, much more powered by the apocalypse kind of scene, I might not focus as much on those damage thresholds and hit points and stress. But because Daggerheart has more of that structure, what I want to do is not react in such a way that it undermines or does not honor the mechanical manifestation, or doesn't honor what the mechanics say happens by as a normal thing. If it's a ranger that's attacking and they have a thing that gives them an extra bonus damage, that should be expressed in how I resolve what they've done. The easiest way to do that is to just use the full normal rules, have them make a damage roll, use damage thresholds, mark HP. But there is that fluidity because ultimately we begin and return to the fiction. But the player characters have made their full characters. They have all these features. And one of the things that we want to do is collaborate and then be fans of the players and fans of the characters. Be a fan of the player, let them use a cool ability. Be a fan of the character, let the character be awesome. Okay, that's part 2. Part 3. We're making great time. I had down in my notes, what are environments? 15 to 20 minutes. How do you use them as a GM? 20 minutes. We're about 40 minutes in. So here, what we're going to do is I'm going to briefly go back to me, and then I'm going to move this bit of my screen, And then I'm going to do this. And I'm going to move this over here. And now I'm going to move back. Boom. And I'm going to bring my screen down. Oh, I need to actually move this here because of where my screen is. And then I'm going to do this so that we can get closer here. So now what I want to do is make one or two environments live with you all. So I'm going to come back to here and I'm going to grab an environment stat block from the SRD, very notably from the SRD, and then I'm going to throw it down in my document here, right? This formatting does not work great. So what can I do? Can I just paste this way? No. So the formatting I don't get to keep. So what am I going to do? I'm going to try to clean this up a bit real quick. Right? Impulses, difficulty, features. Okay. This feature stuff is too messy. So I'm just going to do that. And then what I can do is I'm going to clean up the rest of this real quick. Okay. Right? So this will do for now. What we're going to do is let's do our thunderstorm because I've already been talking about it and we can figure this out. So there's absolutely an argument that a thunderstorm is a traversal environment rather than an event environment. There's something of a question of philosophy and approach. Do I want to think about a thunderstorm where the storm itself is the most important element of the scene? Is a thunderstorm something that I'm going to add to an existing scene? If the thunderstorm is the main part and I want to emphasize how the storm creates challenges for the player characters to move through the space, that's a traversal environment. It's going to play that role within the scene. If the thunderstorm is something I spring on the players, ideally already telegraphed, right, by talking about how bad weather is rolling in, and then something happens and I describe the thunderstorm starting, that maybe we describe as an event environment. For the most part, you can do this either way, but I think it's easiest to understand why you would use one type or the other by reflecting on how we're using it in the scene, right? So we're going to do this thunderstorm environment as an event. I might get halfway through and then change my mind and want to do things as a traversal. Another option, if you're kind of watching along with me, is as we build this, think about how you would build it as a traversal environment instead. And some of these types can overlap, right? You can have an environment that has some social element that might also have a traversal element. You can have a exploration environment where one of the features introduces NPCs, and then you can have a social challenge. These don't have to be really strict and only stay in their little boxes. The types for adversaries, I think, are a little bit more important to keep in mind, more because of how different adversaries round out a situation. I think it's going to be rare enough that you're going to use 2 or more environments in one scene that I'm not as worried about overlap between different types of environments. And that's just my perspective. Okay, so we're going to say, let's have this be a tier 2 event, just because there's a lot of tier 1 stuff, and tier 1 is 1 level. And so if I set the scaling to tier 2, maybe I'll get to use it across a longer range of time. Now, there's also some quick and dirty rules for scaling environments, where you go and look at default damage and difficulty by tier, and that's just in the book. I have a lot of it in my head, but I will go back to the SRD, right? The good practice as a homebrew designer, right? When I'm in that mode, The thing to do is going to be going back to the SRD and following that structure, because that is what the license says to use, and the SRD is written to be the distilled version of the rules. So a thunderstorm, it's going to have a description, right? This is a dangerous roiling storm of lightning, thunder, and torrential rain. Another way I can approach description is I can use this as the place to write my box text. All right, so I could say, and this box text approach is not the one that I think we used most frequently in the core book, but if you're making an environment as prep for yourself, maybe you want to write your box text and you just put it here as the description. So we delete that because that was from the Grove. So an environment has a description and then it has impulses, right? A storm doesn't have will, but if we think about a storm as a narrative actor within a story, what does a storm do? Right? It soaks the field. It drives people into cover or shelter, and it starts fires. Right? A lightning strike can start a fire during a storm. Right? So these impulses are, right, we're going to write them as soak the field, not soaks the field. Right? The impulse is to do the thing, not, we don't describe it as the thing that it does. We describe the thing that, sorry, grammar. Ignore that part. We're going to do soak the field, drive people into cover or shelter, start fires. Focus on the verb as an active thing that you're doing, right? Because you can use impulses as a place to improvise GM moves. Similarly to how you can use motives and tactics to improvise adversary moves that you take, you can use impulses to improvise environment features should you want to. Maybe if you are improvising a environment, all you do is this. Or you give it a name, a tier, probably a difficulty, and you do a description and impulses. You don't bother writing down potential adversaries. You don't even write out full features. Right? Soak the field, drive people into cover, start fires. Those could be 3 features. I don't know that we're going to just do those 3 features, but that's one of the ways that we can approach things. So I'm not going to focus so much on potential adversaries here because this is more event-oriented. And to do that, I would just need to go and scroll through the SRD, and that is not as much as what I'm interested in focusing on in just this moment. If you want to think about your environment in terms of potential adversaries as a bigger element, that's totally fine. It might make more sense if you're building a social environment or maybe an exploration environment, especially like, right, social, it makes sense. Who are you doing the social with? For exploration, right, who else is there? Maybe there's going to be some interaction or adversary conflict element to that. For an event, the adversarial element is mostly literally environmental, right? It is the weather effects. So I'm not going to focus on those for just now. So my first feature is going to be torrential downpour. This is a passive. Right? Constant rain soaks the ground and makes maneuvering much more difficult. Any roll to... So here I'm not going to necessarily automatically use the most buttoned up design language, right? I design in my kind of my own internal vernacular, and then I punch it up and make sure it aligns with the style guide. The style guide for community designers is read the book and use the wording the book uses, wherever you can, basically. Daggerheart can fail a little bit more gracefully in that regard because it is a rulings not rules game in terms of design intent. It still can be really good and handy to write your features in a more standardized fashion if you're doing something that has been done or in a way that is meant to be parallel to or equal to features that already exist in the book. But for here, just right now, pardon me if I use a little bit more informal language. Right, this is the language I would use if I'm writing this for my own personal prep, and then I would polish it up later. Or reaction rolls, really. Rolls to maneuver or maintain balance. Let's suffer disadvantage. Right, so in a torrential downpour, it is harder to move around. It is harder to keep your balance because things are slippery and the footing, your footing is giving out. So that, as a passive, just sets a baseline. Cool, that's a blanket rule that's applicable to this scene. In the torrential downpour, we have this thing. I could, depending on how much I want to abstract or not, I could add something that's about all ranged attacks suffer disadvantage. Right? You're trying to shoot an arrow in a torrential downpour, you're going to get disadvantage. Would the torrential downpour of a thunderstorm make it harder to hit using a magical attack? I think we can make an argument either way, right? We can say that magical attacks have some kind of physical form, and therefore, if they move through space, they are subject to physics, and so we give them disadvantage. We can take another approach where it says, hey, don't worry about that. Just let the characters with the ranged attacks be cool. I don't know that I think that one of those is automatically a smarter design choice than another. But when you use passive features, it's important to give that information to the players as soon as it is relevant, right? I described the thunderstorm starting, and then I would say, so while the storm is active, any action rolls or reaction rolls to maneuver or maintain your balance are going to suffer disadvantage, and ranged attacks are going to suffer disadvantage. Those I tend to want to declare as soon as they could be relevant. I wouldn't declare it, oh, you're making a ranged attack. Well, that's going to have disadvantage now. If I hadn't conveyed information that makes that disadvantage either explicit or very strongly implied, that maybe is an error on my part as the GM. But if I describe the torrential downpour and the whipping winds, and then somebody says, I want to make a ranged attack, and I hadn't already mentioned it, I would say, so I think because you're in this torrential downpour, a ranged attack would be at disadvantage. Does that make sense? Right? Or I might just say, I should have mentioned that earlier. Do you want to do something else? Right? This is a collaboration. I'm not out to get anybody in like a personal way. I'm representing the forces of threat and antagonism and challenge in the story. So if we call that good at torrential downpour, right, we can bold this, and then we would have our feature questions. So, what shape is the rain, right? Because sometimes rain is more globular, right? Sometimes it feels thicker, right? It feels heavy, that every raindrop is thicker. What direction is the storm coming in from? Right? There's like, how much of an angle does the downpour have? Where are rivulets forming, right? If I'm remembering correctly in my head, rivulet can be, or here I'm using it to describe like the flows of water that happen in a storm, right? Because the water is going to go downhill unless it's being immediately absorbed by the ground, right? Where are those little flows of water forming? In that description, I can give more texture to what's happening in this environment to make it make sense that it's harder to maneuver in this space. Right? Or maybe I have feature questions that are, how are you protecting your eyes from the rain? Right? Like, if you don't have glasses or goggles or a hood or a hat or anything, right? Rain is getting in your eyes. Well, that'll definitely give you disadvantage on your ranged attack. It might even give disadvantage in other situations. Thanks so much for the follow, Dennis Illustration. And also to G2 Buddy, Music Gamer 460, and Andrew Bowman, as well as Stoic Lufa, who all followed this week. The plugin or whatever that I have that makes a sound when I get a new follow seems to be deprecated, and so I missed some of those, and that's why I'm going back now. But in this moment, thank you again, Dennis Illustration. So those are some options for my feature prompts, right? These are another way of doing a little bit of prep for yourself in the moment. So that's one feature. Let's do Lightning Strike. Action. This is going to be a fear move. Spend a fear to have a lightning, lightning strike the ground. Right? This thing can be used anywhere within the environment. I'm not going to focus about like, well, this environment is 90 feet wide as a diameter. I don't tend to worry about something quite that specific because in a story, I don't really ever think about, oh, well, where is the edge of the thunderstorm? If the thunderstorm is relevant to the scene, then it's relevant to the scene. If you have a magic thunderstorm where there's like a hard edge, then maybe we're gonna talk about that. But I don't think that's relevant here. So this is going to be spend a fear to have a bolt of lightning strike the ground where a PC is, right? Let's see. Actually, let's do it this way. Lightning strike the ground. If it strikes where a PC is, they must make an agility reaction roll. On a success, they mark a stress. Right? It's stressful to almost get hit by lightning. I think that's a pretty fair argument. On a failure, they take 2d8 plus 4 physical damage, direct physical damage. If you get hit by lightning, your armor won't help you. Now, sometimes armor represents magical protection, sometimes armor represents something that is not just the physical armor, but in this situation, what I want to emphasize is that getting struck by lightning is not the same as getting hit by an ogre's hammer. It's just different. It's just nastier. Now, 2d8 plus 4 is not an overwhelming amount of damage for a tier 2 character. I might go back and tweak that number after kind of revisiting what's all in the SRD. But for here, for right now, that's going to be fine. I am going to fix my typo of agility instead of having it be agility. And then what should our features be? Do you cover your ears to protect against the deafening thunder, right? Do you keep your footing when you dodge the lightning? Thank you, G2 Buddy. Yeah, right. When I'm designing for Daggerheart, the thing I tend to go back to is I'm thinking like a novelist, right? I'm thinking like a novelist, and then I also try to think like a GM or a player, right? How does this work in other games? How does it make sense? What am I focusing on in this in terms of how it is a beat in a story or a part of a story? And then for Daggerheart specifically, right, I'll think about, is this the right level of abstraction, right? In Daggerheart, on the launch day stream, I think Spencer and Matt talked about how when designing for Daggerheart, they will design something and then they'll streamline it and then they'll streamline it again and streamline it one more time. I don't know that everything necessarily needs exactly three passes of streamlining, right? As you get into the habit of designing for Daggerheart, maybe things will not need to be streamlined as often. But if we're looking at this thunderstorm, I might go back and then say, to streamline this, I'm going to remove the thing about all range attacks suffering disadvantage. Or I go the other way and I say, actually, all attacks are going to suffer disadvantage because it's so distracting. But maybe in that case, I go Gale Force Winds passive. I add it as a separate feature so that I don't have to think about different... so that the downpour is about balance and movement, and Gale Force Winds is about attacks, right? All attacks suffer disadvantage from the high winds. That is another form of streamlining. I don't need to say attacks twice. That's not streamlining. That's just trying to type while you're also talking and you're on a stream. But if I do this, right, then I'm going to move these feature questions up here, and then I'm going to make a note that I need to add the feature questions down here. I don't know that I'm going to do them right now. We're going to go back to Lightning Strike. Do you cover your ears to protect against the deafening thunder? Do you keep your footing when you dodge the lightning? Now, here's a question. If I have a lightning strike, but I don't have it hit the player character, or if the player character were standing someplace where something could get lit on fire, even if the player character isn't there, do I want to go ahead and write some stuff about lighting a fire in this same feature? Or do I have a separate feature called Catching Fire that is a reaction? When lightning strikes something flammable, the fire catches and spreads. Trigger a 1d6 countdown, or actually it's activate, sorry. Activate a 1d6 countdown. When triggered, the fire spreads. Loop decreasing. Sorry, I'm live editing myself as I'm thinking, right? This is the streamlining. This is editing. I'm just trying to say it out loud because otherwise you're just seeing me do this, which is not as much fun for a stream. Dennis illustration. I will say I'm very early into my read through of the system and didn't really understand how much the environments were going to be a factor. Very interesting to see how the focus will feed into gameplay. I think if you don't want environments to be much of a factor of your game, they don't have to be. But I think they can be a real value add to your game, especially if something you want to focus on is that feeling of immersion, right? That you are in the world of the story and that you're telling a story that's not as focused on maybe just action, because environments can represent so many other different things that will impact a story. But I'm very glad that this is giving you more to think about. Right, so catching fire here, let's resume what we're doing. Right, fire spreads. Anyone within very close of the fire takes let's say 2d6 physical damage whenever they take. Okay, so actually I'm going to change my wording again. Right? Anyone that takes the spotlight within very close of the fire suffers 2d6 physical damage. Right? You're taking, you're right by a fire. Now maybe I change this to marks of stress. If I were doing a fire separate from a thunderstorm, I might think about the smoke more. But from a narrative standpoint, I don't know that the smoke is the part of a fire that I would be focusing on for this interpretation of a thunderstorm as an event that complicates a scene. Your philosophy or your approach might be different. We could absolutely do a game jam that is write an environment based on blah prompt, right? Write your thunderstorm environment. Or a game jam that is write an environment based off of the prompt of weather, right? That's much broader. But even just thunderstorm, different people could focus on different elements, have different mechanical manifestations, and all of that is cool. I don't want to tell anybody that they're doing it wrong if they take this different kind of interpretation. I would hope that folks are keeping in mind kind of what's already there and some of these questions to consider and maybe like philosophical approaches that I'm describing. You don't necessarily have to share my philosophy, but I'm hoping that folks will think through things as I'm trying to describe and explain why and how I'm thinking through things. So catching fire, let's see. Does the rain slow the fire's advance? Right? What's the balance of storm to rain? Right? Because fires can start in a thunderstorm if there's enough kindling, if things are dry enough, is my understanding, right? I am not a meteorologist, nor am I a firefighter. Narratively, if I have a scene with a thunderstorm and lightning strikes a tree, that's going to start a fire. And if I want that fire to spread, here's the mechanic where I can have it spread. Let me go back and explain this loop decreasing thing for folks who aren't already really comfortable with the language and feature design of Daggerheart. So a countdown is a clock. In other games, we call it a clock. So a countdown is a way of keeping track of something that is going to happen, but not immediately. So I roll a d6, which is why it says 1d6. And then, okay, I rolled a d6 and I got a 3. So I put that 3 out in front of me. Maybe I take an index card and I say fire spread, right? And then the 3 is on that. And then anytime, by default, a countdown will tick down when a player takes an action, right? When they make an action roll. So I have this fire start when lightning strikes the ground. Then a player goes and I go from 3 to 2. And then another player goes and takes an action and I tick it down to 1. And then the action that they take generated a move for me. And so I decide to use that move to not tick down that's countdown by 1 because an action was taken, but to do it by 2. 1 for the action and 1 is my GM move. Now it's 0 and it is triggering, right? When a countdown reaches 0, it triggers. When triggered, the fire spreads. Because this says loop, after it triggers, I roll the die again. Because it says decreasing, so actually I can't do this. Sorry. Loop decreasing is too tricky because loop is start that countdown over again. So if it was, I could have 1d6 loop where every time it triggers, I roll the die again. If I instead do countdown 3, sorry. If I do 4 decreasing, then it's a countdown of 4, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. When it triggers and I have a decreasing countdown, I would reset it to 3. The idea here being that as a fire spreads, it will spread faster. Is that necessarily always true in the real world? No. But narratively, I feel like a lot of scenes that focus on a spreading fire, there is this sense of escalation and that you have to contain it. And so that as it goes, it's going to spread more and more and more. And you can do things differently, right? You might decide that you like the loop element instead because it's more unpredictable. You're not going to know immediately how fast the fire is going to spread until the next time the die is rolled. So there's different ways of approaching it, right? Or it could be activated countdown 1d6 loop. And then you have that inconsistency. 4 decreasing is it's going to take 4, then 3, then 2, then 1. If you have a decreasing countdown, it's probably a good idea to say what happens when the countdown resets to 0. That represents the final manifestation of an escalation that you're representing by the decreasing loop. So when the countdown resets to 0, every a PC takes marks a stress every time they take the spotlight. Right? When the fire has spread so much, you're constantly taking stress from like smoke inhalation or something else. Boom, there we are. The Headman. I think that environments can be really useful for GMs that are coming from crunchy games like D&D. Narrative games can be very strange for both players and GMs when they first encounter them. This gives a bit of framework for the GMs. I absolutely agree. That was definitely part of what I was thinking about. This is not the only way that you can kind of adjust your style or the only tool for kind of moving from one style of game into this kind of hybrid narrative semi-crunchy game that Daggerheart is, but I think it's a great tool. So I'm really glad to see folks responding to it in that way. Right? Does the rain slow the fire's advance? Right? What part of your clothes or gear catches fire? Right? Because these are questions for the GM to consider, for the players to consider, right? Where will the fire spread if left untouched, right? The fire has started here. Where will it go if nobody stops it? You know, if you're in a fight up on the woods in a hill and the woods slope down the hill and then get pretty close to a village, will that fire get to the village? These feature questions can help you not just use the features that exist, use the environment as it is, but connect that environment to other things that are going on, build off of the environment to other parts of your story, right? To other moves, to other elements, to other narrative threads. If I have really good feature prompts in my Thunderstorm, that question of where will the fire spread if left untouched is something that might trigger something in my mind as the scene is going on when I realize, really, they haven't stopped the fire. Oh, shit. Okay. Does this feature need to have a way for somebody to stop the fire? I don't know. Should it? That would make this feature a bit longer, right? Because this is already a reaction so that you can use Lightning Strike against a PC, but then the fire can catch. Maybe I would want to do it as an action instead, and then there could be a separate passive that's about spreading fire. I don't know. I think for now, I'm going to leave this fire as just a thing that is. If I were going to write how to fight the fire, right, I would have dousing the flames as a passive, right? This is another passive feature. If I were following style guide, right, this would go up here because passives go together. So if a PC wishes to put out a fire, they can make a roll, or must complete a progress countdown 4. Right? That's the one of the, so the simplest thing for if a PC wishes to put out a fire, we would say a PC may put out a fire with a successful, and then I would give a trait with a successful instinct roll, right? They know where to put the water. I could say if a PC wishes to put out a fire, they can do so with a successful action roll. And then I put in like a parentheses that says, using different traits in different situations, right? Oh, strength, I'm going to stamp it out. Oh, I want to use knowledge to create a fire break and keep the fire from spreading. Oh, I'm going to use agility to kind of like really expertly do something that puts the fire out, or like to expertly throw the water to douse the fire, or I'm going to use agility to like pull the fuel out so that it can't spread. There's any number of ways that you could use different traits to put out a fire. When you're doing this prep or you're doing this design, right, think about what level of abstraction do you want to do? How much cognitive load is this creating, right? How many extra things are you asking the players to keep track of? Right? Because here there's a countdown for putting the fire out, and there's a countdown for the fire. That can be cool because it creates a sense of a race. If I were doing an environment that was all about the fire, I would probably focus more on this tension of a countdown to put out the fire and a countdown for the fire spreading. As a supplemental element of a thunderstorm environment, I think I'm going to stop myself here. I might even be convinced to remove dousing the flames. And if I were streamlining again, I might save myself the hassle and remove the catching fire thing entirely, as well as dousing the flames. I'm not going to think about the spreading fire so much as the downpour and the lightning strikes that might hit the PCs. I'm going to focus there instead. Or I could have this fire element as well. All right. Because I have other stuff that I need to do today, I'm actually going to be on a couple of panels at Balticon, just across town. I'm going to call it here. This is very fun. I could hang out and homebrew stuff all day. And I probably will, but maybe not all day every time I do it. I will, however, I think, do some more streams that are focused on homebrewing adversaries and environments for Daggerheart, because talking through this process is very fun, and it is a way for me to carve out time specifically to do those things. And that is cool. So we're going to call it here. I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to look on Twitch, and I'm going to see who we can raid. Maybe send some love to folks. Critical Role is rebroadcasting the Age of Umbra Session 0, but I think they probably have enough. Or Critical Role doing well as a show is good for me, because that makes it more likely they will want to hire me to do more Daggerheart. But what I think I will do for our raid is I'm going to send folks over to say hi to Katie Shee. The Hetman has mentioned I am going to be running a stream on Monday, not here, but I am going to be guest GMing for my friend Arvin Elleron, aka Gregory A. Wilson. Greg, as Arv of Arvin Elleron, is doing ArvCon, which is a weekend-long charity fundraiser stream series for the Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation, which does kind of out-of-the-box out of the box thinking and research approaches for fighting cancer. It's very cool. It's a very cool organization, and he's been doing ArvCon for quite some time now and raised a good amount of money. Many of the last few years, I have GM'd a one shot as part of this, as a part of ArvCon for some scientists who are fellows of the organization. Damon Runyon works with Greg to kind of to ask a couple few scientists to kind of to be interviewed by Greg and then to play in a game that somebody runs. And it has been me a number of those years. So this next Monday at 3 p.m. on, what is it? So that's going to be the 26th. So this is 3 p.m. EDT on May 26th. I will be running a charity one-shot of Daggerheart. This will be the first public actual play that I have run of Daggerheart using the final rules. If you were a patron of mine, you will have seen some stuff that I did during the beta. So if you're here now, or if you're watching this before the 26th, I would love for you to join me on May 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern at twitch.tv/ArvinEleron for that charity game of Daggerheart in support of the Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation. Thank you for the reminder, the Headman. I probably would have gotten there, but I might not have, because when I'm streaming, I have a lot of things to keep track of. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. So thank you to G2 Buddy, to the Hetman, to Dennis Illustration, and to everyone else and anyone else who is watching live, or for the folks who are catching this later on in what is, for me, the future. So I'm going to send a raid to Katie Shee, and you can say, Team Turbo is here. If you are going to join the raid, I would encourage you to do so. Go and take a look at what Katie Shee is doing. And if not, I will see you some other time.